Welcome one and all to the AFL Coast to Coast podcast. We are on to episode 11 of the podcast. And last week I was absent. I am back this week. But we've unfortunately lost Blazy, who has gone to the Canadian land. So I'll just be doing this podcast on my own. I'll be covering round 9. Most of the games there. I couldn't get to everyone in depth. Obviously one person on my own. But there are 5 games which I'll cover in depth. Plus a little... we'll call it a segment on how to rate Essendon. And also lightly touch on the rest of the games, any injuries, as always, rising stars, and and we'll just look at the matches coming up after that. So, first of all, we're going to go to the G. Exciting game to kick this off. Carlton vs Melbourne. In the light rainy conditions, Melbourne seemed to show up to the MCG awash. Despite leading the inside 50 count, they would have their first scoreless quarter since the 2000s and be trailing by 30 points. However, Carlton's excellent conversion off a wasteful Demons outfit would only keep them at bay so long, as Melbourne started to equalise the scoring before a last quarter surge spearheaded by a 5-goal haul from Christian Petrarca, who was forced up the ground, would see them fall just painfully short of a terrific comeback, which they lost, unfortunately, 12-5-77 Carlton to 11-10-76. Carlton really locked the clamps on the Melbourne midfield, and despite both teams having prolific midfields on paper, a lot of the stoppage play was actually managed to get stifled, especially in the rainy conditions where it's sort of hard to get that fast ball movement. Kennedy had an excellent soft tag on Petrarca, and there were a lot of tackles by both teams in the midfield, making the first half of the game for Carlton simple. They ground Melbourne to the halt down, forcing lackluster entries, and then they took the ball coast to coast for transition goals. Wiedering was absolutely instrumental in this by shutting down Petty while still being able to crash into the packs when needed, whilst McGovern was able to play more of the free-roaming person, picking off the more calculated entries by Melbourne. The wet conditions also allowed for both May and Lever on the other end of the ground to stamp their defensive authority on the game, having 19 intercepts and 9 intercept marks between them. But when the ball went to ground, Carlton were far too good early with the crumbing game and always got them 3 goals. The midfield chipped in for a few goals, and Big Kerno still got his 2 from collects, not direct marks. McDonald from Melbourne's effort on McKay was also not to be ignored, as he collected 7 intercepts, provided 11 1%ers and 9 spoils. Melbourne had one real saviour up forward, and it wasn't anyone that they had there on the team sheet. It was Christian Petrarca. He was struggling with the tag, got the ball a bit in the midfield, but didn't do that much with him. But as soon as he moved up forward, it was like the area was his own. His hands were absolutely great. 4 marks inside 50 most of the night, and he was so damaging up forward in the forward half contests. To replace him in the midfield, Alex Neil-Bullen floated between the inside and the outside midfield and was absolutely excellent in his pressure and contest, racking up 13 contested possessions, 5 clearances, 11 tackles with his 23 possessions, along with Viney, who recorded 40 pressure acts and 12 tackles. Melbourne's hard work kept them in the game and swung the momentum in their way, with the unfortunate injury to Adam Chera not helping Carlton's cause, and Melbourne's midfield just sort of got on top of it. Along with a huge tackle pressure late, recording 16 tackles inside 50, which could have actually been called 17, with the controversially called dangerous tackle disallowing a late goal, Melbourne dismantled Carlton's defence as the game went on, tiring them out and allowing them to create space and opportunities for goals. All in all, despite the blown lead by Carlton and limited scoring opportunities, they deserved the hard-fought win, with their excellent first-half intercept-based game and the amount of contributors they had for the night. They will be concerned about just how much of their defence grounded to a halt late, and how much overall possession Melbourne were able to have, But on the flip side, Melbourne would be ruining the lack of conventional scoring options. And despite it being a tough night for Tolls, they really could not get the ball to ground early enough and at least pin Carlton that little bit deeper when trying to rebound their 50. As I said this year, it just seems like the missing puzzle piece for them in the 2024 campaign. And the goals that they needed to... And the goals that could be provided per match, by those tall forwards, Van Ruin, even Fritsch is a bit down, Cozzy is a bit down, might actually stamp Melbourne as the premium contender this year. As I said, I think, personally, they might just be a couple of goals away from possibly winning another premiership. Because their defence, really solid. Their midfield has had a few down games, but... overall, they've been able to work through, as I've seen in this game with some of the Petrarca moving forward and a few changes in the rotation, even with Oliver a bit down, they've managed to make things work quite a bit. And as for Carlton, they've been very good this year at scoring from stoppages, but one area that they probably could improve on, especially if they are going to play the waiting game that they did against Melbourne, is being able to score off that half-back chain. And, if they can work the ball a bit better on the outside and, get a few more intercept scores, they might be able to really outmuscle the competition. And especially, with their very dangerous forward line, score a bit more than they are currently and, put the foot on the throats of teams, because they aren't really beating up teams at the moment when they can. We'll move on to the category now. And people must have prayed after last night's match for the same style game, but more offense, because what we got was a fast-paced, high-octane version of the Carlton vs Melbourne game in a beautiful night at the category, GHMBA Stadium, whatever you want to call it. Port would turn up the aggression sliders at the start of this match, as despite missing a fair few players this week through injury, they would play a style of match that claimed they thought they had the tools on the park right now to outgun this solid Geelong offense, recording a 50-21 first quarter and held a 77-36 lead at halftime. They absolutely dominated out the middle and scored through fast pace, play on style, and they attacked very hard. And they also had a few crafty players with Willie Rioli, Ollie Wines, Zach Butters in the forward half, providing absolute headaches for the Geelong backline. Geelong would find a bit of momentum before the half, but missed a few opportunities. However, in the second half, they would start to fire up and retool the way that they were attacking, finding more direct options from their smaller targets, who outpaced Port's defence and chiselled away at the lead. They would force Port to play a more defensive style of game. They stopped playing on as quick and held the ball up a bit more. And to be fair, Port did, until an absolute fade out in the late third quarter, with 3 unanswered goals. One of them was the Willie Rioli 100-metre penalty, which let Geelong fully back into the game, believing they had stakes on a miracle comeback. They continued attacking in the last, and it was almost too much for them, as they would force Port to nervously try and hold on to their dissipating lead. But Port did slow the game down enough, and in the end registered a win at Goomba, their first since 2007, winning 15-11, 101 to 14-11, 95. Port started a lot of work from the centre stoppages, with their entire midfield having huge nights despite the absence of Captain Rosie. As still raw Vicentini would end up holding his own bravely the whole night against Big Gloves and Stanley, the latter of which ended up being subbed early due to middle impact, and fed Ollie Wines, Jason Horne-Francis and Zach Butters to have an absolute night out. 93 disposals between them, 42 of those were contested, 23 clearances and 25 score involvements from the trio. They absolutely led the majority of Port's offense, And also being in there, Willem Drew and Jackson Mead both provided hard nut and class respectively, the latter having probably his best game for the season and had impact in forward distribution and pressure from his 22 disposals at 86% efficiency and 5 score involvements. Helping their fast-paced movement was also the decision to tag Tom Stewart by putting Jed McEntee on him, leaving him with just 1 intercept possession for the first half and 6 for the entire night as he worked back into the game. Port's work rate made it hard for Geelong, both deep in attack and around the ground, with a combination of Esava, Aaliyah and Zirks shutting down almost all of Geelong's distinctive wide attacking game. However, the substitution of Stanley led to a slew of tactical changes, with Bickloff's speed matching Visitini, Ocean Marlin getting put straight into the middle once he came on, first time he's really attended the centre bounces, and had a solid third quarter, and in general it would be the Cats end up playing the fast football after half-time, as they started to even out the stoppage contest and have some excellent back-half transition, led by one instrumental Zach Guthrie, 24 possessions, led Geelong, 7 marks, 9 intercepts, 549 metres gain, and 6 score involvements. His brother actually did quite well as well. Geelong also switched their attack from wide to direct, as I sort of hinted before. And yeah, Port weren't able to keep up. Port weren't able to stop them having shots directly in front of goal. Recorded 12 goals with an angle of no worse than 15 degrees, as Geelong at least forced Port to kick to a wide spread of entries, even when they were struggling off turnover. Geelong would also catch on to Port's ball movement, both slow and fast, started to generate some forward half intercepts. They recorded 6-2 forward half intercepts for the night compared to Port. And yeah, as much as Port will be wondering how they managed to almost blow such a convincing start to the match, Geelong were absolutely the ones who initiated their own turnaround and refused to bend to Port's will despite being put on the back foot. They will probably have a look at not letting teams dominate them once they get their kick mark game going and get the ball to ground where they are pretty solid. Port will still be worried about the ease of some of the scores against them, part of which is just the way that they came out and played. And, got them the big lead in the first place. But the fact still remains that small forwards can absolutely tear this team to shreds. So the defensive problems from last year sort of still remain. The problem's just gone from the ball in the air being dangerous for the tall forwards to the ball on the ground being dangerous for the defense. Thankfully, both teams are thankful for the other avenues of goals that stepped up, as both teams shut down the tall forward setup, and it led to the heart speeding fast every time the ball hit to the deck. As you saw, Tyson Stengel, 4 goals won, a couple from contest. Gary Rowan was one of the small forwards. Well, not forwards, but he pushed up fast a lot. Brad Close kicked another couple of goals. I'm not sure why I didn't talk about any of the forwards when I was talking earlier, so I'm playing catch-up here a bit. And yeah, as I said, for Port, it was mainly just the distribution from their midfield. Also a nice couple from Darcy Bird-Jones. He's finding his foot as a forward. Kane Farrell had a lot of long bombs. So yeah, like really, for how high scoring this game is, it wasn't actually, I would say, not a lot of the usual subjects. Tyson Stengel is still having a fantastic year. But yeah, as I said, it wasn't quite the Geelong attack that we're used to seeing. But the fact that Chris Scott was able to just click his fingers and said, yep, we need to move these little pieces around, and it got them back into the game so hard, is an absolute credit to them. And while it is a loss at home, especially such a strong home at GHMBA Stadium, I would say that Geelong still really played a solid game. And I wouldn't be that worried about it. And Port will just sort of be, wiping the sweat from their eyebrows, because they needed a win. Like, especially if you are going to blow that game against Adelaide, you need to turn around and look for a team where you can pinch a win, a top 4 win somewhere, and luckily they did it very fastly afterwards, and, soft in the running for top 4. I would imagine that they would still stay in the bottom 4 finalists the way that they're playing now, but, they might get a run on. As I said, it just depends on how much they're able to convert, as is normally the case with Port Adelaide. Alright, now we'll go to the MCG, where the Essendon Football Club took on the GWS Giants in a match that was expected to see the high-flying Bombers crash back into reality. The Giants got off to a big start, exposing one-on-one matchups and a few Don errors in the first half, and it would see them have a comfortable lead to an Essendon side who were only really staying in the game through the conversion of some of the toughest shots that they had on goal. Then in the third quarter, the Bombers took full control of the game, winning the quarter 33-11 as Zach Merritt looked to impose himself as the leader of the Don squad and inject himself into the game. The Giants would get some flow back in the game in the last quarter, but none of it resulted in much score as the Bombers came away with this match 12-10, 82 to 9-8, 62. Despite their defensive concerns early, coming up and battling the third best offense in the league, the Dons proved that they can tighten up if their stoppage work and midfield pressure is up to snuff. And they're at least able to prevent a lot of the damaging entries from actually happening at all. If you win the ball and you have the hands on the ball, the opponent can't kick it forward. So yeah, it was a very uncontested game style still, with not much score coming from turnovers. Essendon were able to generate a lot more around the ground, but gave the Giants some free forward half turnovers that led to easy goals. But yeah, as I said, it was a stoppage where Essendon were king, not only scoring a healthy amount from both centre and around the ground stoppages, but also being very clean with it, minimal turnovers, and despite the somewhat even exact number-wise clearances, I think it was 37-38 maybe in favour of GWS. Yeah, and it all started with the tap work, with the Dons smashing Briggs in the raw hit-out count with the tandem of Goldstein and Peter Wright. For GWS, Briggs did provide, however, with 10 clearances in his own and still had a fairly solid night out. Sam Durham led the charge with 25 possessions, 5 clearances, 4 tackles, and 8 score involvements at 76% efficiency. Merritt did still rack up a lot of possessions, but they mainly happened in the second half, with 24, 10 of those contested, 4 clearances, and 5 tackles. Caldwell also won a lot of clearances around the ground, getting 7 clearances, 5 score involvements, 6 tackles. And Green and Kelly for GWS had big games in both the inside and outside midfields respectively, with Green going tough for 34 possessions, 18 contested, 7 clearances, 5 score involvements, and 5 intercepts. I should say that's Tom Green, not Toby. And Kelly going class with 21 possessions, 10 of those contested, 6 tackles, and a goal at 81% efficiency. While the 1-on-1 contests were a bit shaky for the Dons, as stated earlier, their intercept game and the back half was absolutely fantastic, with Redmond, Mackay, and Kelly getting 10, 9, and 7 intercepts each, respectively. They also set up 2024 uncontested king Nick Martin to rebound to his heart's content and start some back half change, as he was involved with 7 score involvements to go with his 31 possessions and 10 marks. Sam Taylor was absolutely fantastic for the Giants and Idun kept Stringer mostly quiet. They were forced to work hard but still provided good pressure and defense with 17 intercepts, 10 spoils, and 31 percenters between them. And Kyle Langford, the Dons' most vital piece this year, snagged 4 goals, was the most prolific forward all night. Green and Hogan, Toby Green, both were very good early on, scored 2 goals each, but that sort of dropped off after the entry sort of died up for GWS. But how clutch is Kyle Langford? And we'll get into it a bit when I go into Essendon's segment, but that man at any moment, at any angle, just seems to be nailing them at the moment. And yeah, as I said, in the end of the day, it was a very simple scenario for Essendon. If they got their hands on the ball, they were able to set up the football game exactly how they wanted to. In the first half, they didn't. The second half, they were able to control the tempo and went at a sort of calculated pace and didn't allow GWS to score from stoppage, where they would be more exposed in those one-on-one matchups, which I was talking about earlier. And they still ran hard on the fast plays when they did manage to break away, to find space for those uncontested chains of fast ball movements, and they kept the ball, the foot on the throat of GWS when they got their lead, and sit on third of the ladder, which we're going to go into. Thanks to Iblis on our Discord where we chat about football. He asked what I thought about Essendon and whether I thought that they could win some tougher matchups that are coming up for them later in the year. The next one, I think, was Carlton at the MCG. And they got a few others. Collingwood, Geelong. And yeah, a lot of good informed teams. But yeah, technically, Essendon, they sit on third on the ladder with a percentage of 98.3. The lowest ever percentage to occupy third spot on the ladder. Their biggest loss this year has been a 69-point loss to Port Adelaide, to which they followed it up with their biggest win of the year, a 29-point emphatic win over the Bulldogs. And in that game against Port Adelaide, it was really the one game where their midfield couldn't get their hands on the ball, Port being one of the best clearance teams. So you can sort of see why that they were beaten by so much. But yeah, despite being labelled as making up the numbers at this part of the year, well, at least in the top four, they just, as I said, beat GWS soundly by 20 points. And yeah, I want to go through in this segment just what's changed in the Essendon side over last year. Remember last year they did actually make the finals, but didn't really threaten much, losing elimination final against Carlton by memory, and what to make of their form and try and gauge their threat level with them having such a disparity from the stats, which I'm about to bring up, and how they're performing. Yeah, Essendon, I would say they're trying to accomplish similar to what they did last year, which is to make the finals despite most statistical measurements saying they do not deserve to be a finals team. If you look at the Premiership quadrant, which is a plot that you sometimes see, that where they list every team's relative attacking and defensive metrics against each other. If you've got good attack and defense, you go in the top right quadrant. If you've got good attack but a bad defense, you go in the bottom right quadrant, and so on and so forth. And yeah, if you look at the teams in the bottom left quadrant, which is below average attack and below average defense, you see teams you would expect to be there. West Coast, Hawthorn, North Melbourne, and Richmond. The only other team there in 2024 at the moment is Essendon, being the 9th best attack in the league and the 12th best defense in the league. It's important to note that they weren't statistically very rated in a lot of metrics last year, but they have shown a marked improvement from 2023 to 2024. The most obvious categories for this is the contested possessions. They win a lot more clearances, they get their hands on the ball, they just overall get more disposals, and ground ball gets is a huge up for them. So yeah, in terms of development, the Essendon edge that they said they were going to bring into this season, you could argue has been there, and they've leaps and bounds from scores from stoppages. The rest, though, it isn't really much above or below the average for 2024. They're not leading a lot of things. They're not really even... In fact, they're sort of below average in a lot of other metrics. But yeah, it's not really much to write home about. So, when you watch the Essendon games and, you see how close they are, you can sort of say that Essendon this year, they're just sort of hanging around teams. When they dominate, they don't flog them, but they're not always out of the contest. And yeah, 4 of 5 wins this year for Essendon have been a one-score game. The other being the draw against Collingwood, which still provided premiership points. So if you do what some people like to do at the end of the year and act like most one-score games are coin flip and even it all out, you could argue that Essendon's true ladder position, or even just the range that they should be, is a lot bigger. They could probably be 2 losses below where they are now, or theoretically even 4 if you are going negative if every result was flipped. But yeah, that would in fact push them out the 8 as it stands at the moment. The Dons, the other thing that's to note about them, they are converting very well. And in these close games, you only need 1 or 2 extra to go through to notch a win. And if you look at the ladder where teams score their expected score based off the shots that they took compared to league average, the Dons should actually only be placed at 3 wins, joining Carlton, GWS and Geelong as teams currently inside the 8 that wouldn't be there if they weren't converting so well. Don't take that too seriously. I'm not trying to say that Essendon belong out the 8. It's just quite clear that there is a fair chunk of what they're doing this year that is definitely just going their way, really. But yeah, despite all this, Essendon do have overall one of the easier fixtures, in my opinion. But they haven't yet had much of that easy run, which sort of happens now with 3 out of the 4 next games being against the bottom 4. They are consistently scoring at least 70 points per match, and although they aren't great defensively on paper, they've only conceded 100 points to both Port and Sydney this year, both away from home, and they have Setterfield and Ridley to come back to bolster up their defence. They have a lot of young talent. They're slightly older than the AFL list, though, and they had the 5th highest amount of game experiences on their list. So this is a side that does have the veteran capacity to play a full season out, especially since they have started off well. Hopefully that they won't dip if some metrics do sort of return to average. I don't know. And yeah, their off-season recruitment has been excellent, with Mackay, Dersma, Gresham, Goldstein all providing value. Darren Perkins, Caldwell have added to the depth of Essendon's midfield and allow Parrish to play around the ground more, and they have stopped being scored against so easily in stoppages, sans the Port game of course, which has sort of helped them compared to last year where they would get absolutely wrecked by teams in portions of the game. And we've mentioned him before, the threat of Carl Langford in the air, with also Gresham and Stringer having patchy but very good seasons on the ground, and a decent amount of forward pressure they like. Although they don't generate too many turnovers, they do get a lot in the forward half, and if they can continue to do that, they will be able to create their scoring options for the entire part of the year, despite not having a stereotypical forward line with a one really big tall key forward. Peter Wright is there, but he hasn't really taken stake in this year because he's missed those 3 games and sort of been in and out. So yeah, in conclusion, I think you've got to have a bit of the faith in what the Dons are able to do. They're definitely better than what they were last year and they made finals. So really, with the run that they have, they should make their way again. And while I don't think that they will reach top 4, and to, more directly answer the question that Iblis asked me, I don't think they might be able to handle some of the grittier defensive midfields, like Carlton, Melbourne, and the Swans. Carlton and Melbourne in particular. Carlton obviously dominate the clearances when Melbourne defend clearances so well. And the Swans will provide a bit of a headache later in the year with their restriction of ball movement, which Essendon they like to do. They're not always necessarily fast, but they like to mix uncontested with fast ball movement. So yeah, I guess that sort of edges to me thinking that they're not going to be top four. And I think if they just get a win against any of the top teams, I would give them a pass. But I do think they can maintain a level of consistency and make the finals from here. I don't think that they're sort of a joke team making up the 8. I think that they're actually sort of, getting there. And in terms of finals, when scoring becomes a lot harder and defense becomes paramount, I think the Dons are really a year away from going, that deep prelim finals run. But if they can manage a home final and face up against a less defensive team that might sneak up 7th or 8th, maybe a Brisbane or a Adelaide or who's the other one? Or maybe even Western Bulldogs, there might be a chance to finally record their first finals win in so long. I don't have the stat. Iblis and every Essendon fan's heard it. I don't need to repeat it, but yeah, as I said, cautiously optimistic. I know Dons fans are normally very concerned about Essendon providing hope. They normally get hyped up by the media, and especially from a lot of the talking heads that I've seen, they haven't really actually talked about, again, how bad the Dons are statistically compared to some of the league. But as I said, sometimes I think the game's a bit more than the stats, and I think what you see is the Dons having a definitive game plan. They're able to convert from it, and they might be lucky, but I would rather be lucky while developing, and have a chance to build on some more finals experience, with a list that they are, they do have a minor premiership window. I don't think they're actually as rebuilding as I first thought they were going to be at the start of the year. And yeah, I think that about sums up all I want to say about Essendon. I hope that was insightful. Sorry for all the other fans that haven't had a deep dive into their teams yet. I haven't really gone super deep into why I think Essendon's alright. So yeah, hopefully that provides a bit of insight. And the final game that I wanted to go deeper into, I watched half of this game. I was out on Mother's Day, but it was an absolute thriller. Given both these teams were slow to start the season, a win was absolutely imperative to keep their finals hopes alive, with both these teams getting a bit of their 2023 form back. Throughout the whole game, though, neither team could get too far away from each other, which led to the third closest draw in AFL history, with quarter-time margins of 3-2-1-0. Such an awesome sequence. I think it's the only time that sequence of margins has ever happened, and it led to a final score 13-12, 90. Both teams copied each other. Nothing separated them. Another draw for this season. While Brisbane didn't win the clearances, they were very dangerous around stoppage, especially in the forward half of the ground. They did, however, struggle to move the ball from their back half, which is where Adelaide had a lot of good fast-paced ball movement. Combined with quick score off turnovers, this gave Adelaide's forwards new life. They looked very rejuvenated this round. They were creating space, leading well, and getting a lot of central shots. Walker, Keys, Fogarty all had 3 marks inside 50, with Walker getting 2 goals for the night, and Fogarty looking so dangerous. Great to see him have a bit of a comeback game. He was great. 4-1 performance. He was good in the air, he was good on the ground, and overall it was sort of really needed, because despite his 2 goals and 6 score involvements, Adelaide would have to find other avenues of attack rather than just going through Tex, as Brisbane's Jackson Payne had a defensive performance. He gathered 8 intercept marks from 13 intercepts overall, 4 tackles, whilst Andrews complimented him with 9 intercepts, 5 intercepts of those marks, 13 spoils, and both kicking at around 85% efficiency. Himmelberg and Rankin, however, brought a lot of forward pressure, beating 2 and 3 goals respectively, with Rankin being involved in 9 score involvements, 5 clearances, and 24 possessions, 17 of those per effective. However, the most prolific generator for Adelaide wasn't in the forward line, it was in the midfield. Captain Jordan Dawson, he's back, baby. Out the middle with 10 score involvements, 11 inside 50s, 7 tackles, 5 clearances, and 27 disposals, 11 which were contested at 85% efficiency, with a massive 800 metres gained. Crouch, also for the midfield, was very hot with this pressure. 13 tackles, 29 pressure acts, 6 intercepts, 8 clearances, and 28 disposals. 15 of those were contested, which is always funny. Him not always being known as the most contested player, but he has actually picked a lot of that up this year. So yeah, despite running a lot of their score through clearances, it wasn't actually the usual Bulls for Brisbane generating these opportunities, but the efforts of some of their younger and fringier players, the best of which, by far, was Sam Berry, who had a monumental effort roaming between the inside and outfield midfield, 30 disposals, 15 contested, 6 clearances, 5 intercepts, 7 score involvements, 22 pressure acts, and 1-1 direct score. Calamachi kicked 2 very important goals late and had 4-1 with 3 marks inside 50s and 6 score involvements. And I thought Bruce Reville continued to impress with his limited game time. He had 6 intercepts, 11 pressure acts, and some crucial score involvements from his 50% time on ground. And Logan Morris for Brisbane, I think is a second game player, got a few cheeky goals. McCluggage and Cameron were also involved in a lot of Brisbane's attack. They had 9 and 10 score involvements respectively, and both scored a goal. McCluggage was also very damaging in the midfield with 31 disposals, 15 contested, and 4 clearances. And overall, while both teams would have preferred the 4 points over the 2, you would have to imagine they have shown signs that they're back. For Adelaide, it was a bit worse since they had another loss at Adelaide Oval. It's not quite the Croval that it was last year, although they did beat Port there, so, got to have some wins. And unfortunately, they've lost one of the most improved defenders in the comp. One of my favourites, I've been mentioning him a few weeks, Josh Worrell, 8 to 12 weeks. It is really sad to see him out. And yeah, they have to face Collingwood at the G next, but they have a run of 3 out of the 4 bottom teams. So they may be able to get back into punching distance from the 8 as they go forward. But Brisbane, on the other side, competing for that, 7th or 8th spot, get a few players back as well. They have a run of bottom 8 opponents for the next 4 games as they look to restructure and rebuild with the slew of players that they have lost to season-ended injuries. And yeah, I think that pretty much sums up all the games that I've, either watched or put very specific notes into. Again, as I said, it was a very sweaty couple of days between Carlton and Melbourne and Geelong and Port. I'll tell you what, I was absolutely drained after the Port game. But yeah, I hope overall that people had a good round watching football. And yeah, also hope you all had a good Mother's Day. Going to the other games, I've written brief points, but I won't be going too far into details or looking up the scores. If you want to see who was the best players and all that, you probably just have to look at the team sheets this year because, this one's already a bit awkward to start with. We'll start off at Freo, facing Sydney at Optus Oval. In a very unfortunate circumstances, they were unable to convert against the Swans. As they continue to dismantle teams by taking away their marking options and having high tackling intensity, leading to high score of turnovers. Sarong was a ball magnet. Sharp had a fantastic game on the wing. Liam Ryan was prolific. While for Sydney, it was really their midfield core with Heaney, Florent, Goulden, Warner all having terrific games. And Jordan Hayward, rumoured to get a big contract thrown his way by other clubs, kicked 4. Freo did overpossess the ball a bit, but they weren't really out of the contest. It was really just the goal kicking and a bit of polish. And, as much as it is sad to... Well, as much as, you're never going to know how much it affected the players, obviously the tragic passing of former teammate Cam McCarthy was, it's hard to say that it wouldn't have unsettled it. Happened on the day, and they had some beautiful tributes towards him. And overall, I'm just sort of glad that they were able to respectfully honour him. And yeah, as I said, he clearly sorely missed by some of the players on field. And, you never expect or want to force players to play after such bad news. And no one would have, thought worse of them if they decided that they weren't up for the game. But, as I said, it was just good to see people get around him. A lot of the commentary around Fremantle's game has been very respectful. And yeah, at the end of the day, it's just football. And what the players were able to do, despite the circumstances, should be respected. So we'll give Fremantle a bit of a pass for that game, despite, obviously, probably wanting to convert and at least take it up to Sydney. As I said, sometimes it just happens. And, as much as I don't really believe in huge psychology in matches, there are, things that flow and ebb the game towards your favour. As I said, this was just one of those things where, it was something you can never plan for. And, full credit to Freo for showing up and performing despite the circumstances. I'd also like to extend apology, because despite it being the other close game of the round, I just did not have time to go through and watch the Hawthorn Saints game, which was very close. Hawthorn managed to get their second win in a row, which was fantastic. It was at their second home in Launceston. With both teams struggling to be... with both teams struggling in the Tassie conditions... a lot of turnovers. Marshall and Steele, however, led the charge for the Saints. Josh Paddle switched forward at halftime, kicked 2 goals. Great performance by him. But for Hawthorn, Newcomb and Eamon went absolutely huge. Lloyd Meek won the majority of the hitouts, and Will Day continued to impress. And I will say for the Saints that they didn't convert very well. They could have probably won this game. But yeah, unfortunately, it just continues that sort of middling patch for them. Now, unfortunately, I've got to cover a bit of the Richmond Bulldogs game. It was a very sad night for Tigers fan. They're just simply running out of players. Only 26 players of their list are now eligible to be selected. The rest are out injured, with injuries in that match specifically to Banks, Graham, and Rioli Jr. And they just couldn't get their pants on it, as the Dogs managed to feast, with Bontempelli, Treloar, Harms and Richards absolutely feasting for them. Slightly good news for Richmond. I thought Dion Prestia, from what I could see on the stats, was very good on return. But yeah, as I said, I didn't watch this match. I did watch the other match, which was just as much of a blowout, not really all that interesting. But the one interesting thing, it was played in the Northern Territory. And this was the game against Gold Coast and the Kangaroos in horrid, hot and humid conditions. The Gold Coast would absolutely roast the Roos past the halfway point, as the Kangaroos fell into a hole defensively, conceding 78 points in the last half. Mac Andrews, huge down back, solid hands in a game that was really tough to mark in, as was Charlie Comben, who was really the Roos' only performing defender. Took Miller, was very classy, but also hard at the ball. With Rao having a very quiet game. He was soft-tagged, didn't have a lot of possessions, but tackled a lot. But yeah, as I said, it's great to see the games in the Northern Territory. I like the game being brought there. I like to see around 3 games per season if possible. But yeah, as I said, with the news about Northern Territory pushing for the team, I'm not 100% sure that a 10-game home season for them would produce watchable football. I think it would impact a lot of the ability to pull a crowd from wherever they set up. And the fact that they're probably going to put a bit of infrastructure if they do make that move. So, I'm a bit tentative. I'm not that well read on the whole proposal, but it is interesting. And, as I said, Northern Territory fans, they're a passionate bunch. I love to see, the possibility of them getting a team, but I don't think it's as likely. The other thing to note for the Kangaroos, McKercher, he won the Rising Star for this week. He has been very solid during the season. His ball use off the halfback's been very solid. He hasn't overly lost his opponents too much during the year. And yeah, as I said, he sort of combined with Sheasel to at least be generating some movement of halfback. And I've got to put an apology. I've been gunning him for the Rising Star nomination all year, but I did not know that you have to be 21 and under and not 22 and under to win the NAB Rising Star. The 22 and under is a separate list by the AFL. So Sam Closey, unfortunately, will never win it. So I'm on my own. I am going to nominate him as the Coast to Coast Rising Star that's a bit older than the other stars, but is still very good award. And he will expect his prize in the mail as soon as this podcast generates money, which is probably never. And on to the final game I haven't covered yet. Collingwood were all over West Coast and dominated in the first half, but a slew of injuries to both teams led to a very boring second half with only 47 points being added to the total. For West Coast, Petrocelli, or however you want to pronounce it, whether you want to pronounce it incorrectly like me, got an knock early and was subbed out for McGovern. Had to go to hospital with McGovern had to go to hospital with rib complaints. Though we did train today apparently, which is good news for them. Collingwood lost Bytel in the McGovern concussion. They lost Bytel in the McGovern collision to concussion, and Howe also had a sore groin. He was subbed off. And Harvey Harrison, young kid, unfortunately had a ankle issue in the first quarter and didn't see the field. The only other thing to note, Collingwood's midfield had an absolute day out. Dacos, Pendles and Crisp all went really big. And they scored 71 of their points from their stoppage chain. So, yeah, unfortunately, much like last year, this was just a game where Eagles couldn't get hand on the ball. And very reminiscent of the sort of losses that they experienced last year. Now, finally, thank you if at this point you've still kept on listening, because I must admit this has been a bit harder than I thought to get through, even though it is a shorter episode. But we'll go through the Week 10 matchups. The first one being between Geelong and the Gold Coast. Gold Coast still, they're able to stay in the Northern Territory as they have another game in Darwin, and they haven't lost there yet. Geelong might actually find it a bit hard. I don't think they will lose this game. I think Geelong are actually pretty solid when the ball goes to ground, which, despite Gold Coast having a lot of victories there, they've normally faced, some of the more struggling sides, as it tends to be. Normally some of the lesser teams get incentive from the AFL to play their games, in lesser populated areas. As I said, it might be their first loss up there. But honestly, you wouldn't completely rule it out. It is a bit weird that this game is the marquee game. I'm not sure, again, if the last game was anything to go by, that it will be a thrilling contest, but it's possibly a bit closer than you think. Especially, if Geelong can set up their backline as well as they did in the game before, and Mac Andrews can continue taking those marks like he's a taller version of Tom Stewart. As I said, I'll probably tip Geelong. I might make the margin a bit smaller than I normally would. And then we get a top four clash, Sydney versus Carlton. It's sort of, Very weird. It's like two of the best negating teams in some aspects. Carlton negate a lot in the stoppage, whereas Sydney negate a lot of transient ball movement, which, as I've mentioned before, Carlton do struggle a tiny bit to move the ball from defense to their offense. A lot of short chains, which might suit Sydney in this match. However, as is the case, when you're winning the ball out the middle, you tend to always, have a good chance to at least score, which is what Carlton's been doing all year. So really, it's up to Sydney to try and mitigate as much as that as possible. I'm actually going to tip Sydney here. I think all round they're a bit more threatening in all facets of the game, despite obviously Carlton playing very well this year. But yeah, I will say they may be exposed, like many teams, by the tall forward line of Carlton. Sydney obviously having to shuffle around a few of their players over the last few years with the McCartans being out and Melican coming back in. So we'll see how they go there. Next, first game of Saturday is Collingwood Adelaide at the MCG. Collingwood seem to be in a rich vein of form. By all statistical accounts, they're similar to the form that they were in last year, so it might be a chance to consolidate it for them. Whereas Adelaide, obviously, while there were a lot of positives for last match, and obviously they had the great win against the showdown against Port, we'll be thinking that this could be a game that really defines their comeback into the season, if they're able to do it. I personally don't think they're able to. I think Collingwood's defence, for one, is a bit too strong. I think Adelaide, while the pieces have been coming together, might struggle to, again, find form against such a stalwart defence. In the midfield, it will be interesting to see how they match up, especially with Adelaide's midfield really getting on top. If Adelaide were to win, I can imagine Dawson and Rankin again being two standout performers for them. And yeah, as I said, in terms of defense, although they did lose Josh Worrell, as mentioned earlier, Collingwood still are a bit iffy conventionally up forward. So hopefully they can restructure to a just okay offensive team and at least make this a close game. I'm tipping Collingwood. But yeah, it might... If all goes well for Adelaide, I think both teams, it might be a low-scoring-ish game. And yeah, generally it's not too much between teams in those sort of games, and they might be able to provide a contest. GWS versus the Western Bulldogs. GWS, at times, I thought they were the best team of the year. Have had a couple of losses in their belt now, looking a tiny bit shakier than they did. Still going great. Versus the Western Bulldogs, who have at times looked absolutely phenomenal, and at other times looked absolutely putrid, with their midfield going in and out of games by game basis. I think the Bulldogs are slowly pulling the structure that they want to go forward with as the years go on. The rounds go on. I do think that GWS should be able to take this, but I think the Bulldogs' offense, their forward line, might actually be able to cause them a few headaches. As mentioned before, GWS's forward line did struggle with the Bombers, with their ability to create space off fast attacking movements, which is what the Dogs are able to do at times. So, they'll have to keep tight screws on in the midfield. But on the flip side, GWS's attack should have stakes on the Bulldogs. It's hard because the range of margins for this game is pretty massive. I'm gonna give it a respectable win to GWS Giants. Moving forward, St Kilda versus Fremantle. Honestly, two teams that have different struggles in the forward line. St Kilda's obviously being a lot worse than Fremantle's and struggling more in the tall forward marking options, whereas Freo struggle a lot sometimes in their forward entries and their ball to ground stuff. But yeah, Fremantle's inside midfield still going absolutely fantastically. Saints still really struggle in that area, defending off clearances. So I'm going to give Fremantle the win there. I don't really see this match being close. I'm not really that keen on St Kilda. But yeah, hopefully if St Kilda make it a dirty contest, Fremantle might be able to stall because they're not exactly the cleanest team in the competition. Brisbane versus Richmond, two teams that have lost some players for the season. Richmond's is just 3 times more. It's at the Gabba. It's very hard to say anything positive about this game for Richmond, apart from the fact that if it's a humid night at the Gabba, maybe the ball goes to ground a bit more. They're able to make it more of a contest, like the game they won against Sydney, which they had little right to winning. But yeah, as I said, it is just hard to see how they're going to win from there, especially if Brisbane's midfield outmuscles them. And set up their game like they have in years past. So yeah. Another game that I don't expect to be too close, Essendon versus North Melbourne. It's the first game on Sunday. And yeah, Essendon, they're looking very dangerous up forward. And I don't really see how North could approach this game, considering that they've versed other weak defensively team and still haven't been able to put a score up to rival them. I will say in the midfield is probably where they're looking to lift, because as I said, North have that grit in the midfield. It hasn't always shown, but they have won the clearances. So in this game where Essendon has set up a lot of game from their midfield clearances or stoppage clearances, if they can win a few contests and work hard, they may be able to restrict the ball getting down there. That's probably their best chance of making this game close. But otherwise, I see Essendon winning this game comfortably. It's not really much to say about that. Another probably not so close game. None of these Sunday games look to be that interesting on paper, but hopefully they might provide a bit of a challenge. Port Adelaide versus Hawthorn at the Adelaide Oval. Hawthorn, not the strongest clearance team. Starting to build a bit of movement. But overall, it's hard to see them being anything. I know I've said out-muscled a lot, but really, there's a few bad midfield matches coming up from this week. I will say Hawthorn, they've kept teams down in score the last few weeks. So if they can defensively restrict Port Adelaide, Port's always going to get a fair few entries in, and you would expect against Hawthorn that they might be able to convert a bit. But the pressure will be on if they do manage to halt some of them. Hawthorn do have a bit of decent outside run, so from the kick in and maybe some turnovers, they might be able to generate some score. But overall, I just see Port Adelaide having too many avenues to goal. And finally, West Coast versus Melbourne. West Coast had a horrid game against Collingwood. You're not expecting them to go too close against the current top 4. They have improved a lot. And Subiaco Oval, it may be a bit hard for them. I think they've got a chance of maybe defending well against Melbourne. They did show some signs of it eventually against Collingwood. So if they can keep Melbourne to under 100, especially with their iffy forward line, I think that will be really good for them. In terms of their scoring, it's very hard with how dour Melbourne is in the back line, especially if they don't get Jake Waterman back. He's still a test. So, yeah, it's up to West Coast to get creative. But if they see what Essendon were... Carlton were able to do in the midfield, maybe... I don't want to say they try and restrict Melbourne's stoppages, because, as noted before, West Coast are the number one dice rollers in the competition. They move the ball forward. They accept that they're going to lose some contests. But, if they can at least make that sort of game even, they might make the game a bit closer. Then what might be expected. But otherwise, I have Melbourne winning quite comfortably. And yeah, I think I'm going to wrap that up from here. I hope you had a good time listening. Next week, I hope to try and bring a guest on because, as you might know, noticed, it's a bit hard without the back and forth. I'm just reading off essentially my notes for the week. I do put a lot of effort into them, and I hope you appreciate this insight. But hopefully, we can get a bit more flow going next week. And yeah. But apart from that, I've hoped you enjoyed this breakdown. I'm going to be posting this up, and hopefully I'll keep the socials in the comments like normal. So if you can and like this episode, maybe not this specific episode, but the series, make sure to subscribe, like our socials, comment if you do. Again, if you have any questions and you want me to do like a Essendon breakdown for your team, or want me to deep dive into players, or what I think about certain things, I'll be happy to do that again if that was an enjoyable segment. I do think I brought some good information there. I'm not sure overall how much I presented that nicely, but yeah, apart from that, I hope you all have a good one. I hope you've all had a good Mother's Day, no matter how you chose to celebrate it, whether you were celebrating, whether you were remembering, whether you're a mother yourself. We hope you had a good one. And yeah, I'm signing out. I hope this was okay. Bye.